Right. Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the TSF Zoom meeting. Right. Our parish notices that our next meeting will be on the 19th of November. We have three speakers: Leila Weinstein, Barry O'Neill, who I certainly saw here with the hat on, and Lynn Phipps. So that's 19th of November, same place, same time. And then our December one will be the 10th of December. So if anybody has any suggestions for what we do on the 10th of December, it's our Christmas one. So anything with a sort of Christmas, New Year, midwinter theme would be perfect. We've got a few other things coming up. In fact, we've got lots of other things coming up. There's the FDSS conference, 11th and 12th of November in London, the dance conference, but it looks very interesting, even though it's a dance conference. 17th of February is the Broadside Day in London, and we're working on a TSF conference, one-day conference in Stowmarket in Suffolk, probably 6th of April. Joining up with the East Anglia Traditional Music Trust. And then there's a big conference, 20th, 21st of July. The idea has come from us, but it's we're joining up with FDIS, and it will be at Cecil Sharp House. And that'll be a two-day conference talking about the collectors and collecting and so on. It's called Collectomania, and we hope it'll be a major chance for people to gather together and really look at the collectors and their work and their legacy and so on. So there's lots of stuff to look forward to. This evening we have two papers and then me.
Steve?
No, yes?
Can I just say quickly, people may be wondering about the promised video of the TSF conference. We haven't actually had a chance to talk about the conference that we had in Sheffield. That was Steve wasn't able to go, so he'd completely forgotten we'd ever had it.
It was a train strike.
And there will in due course be a video of it, but for technical reasons everything got a bit more complicated than we had hoped, so it's a major editing job to get that ready. But I'm hoping it'll be up on the TSF website, TSF YouTube channel before Christmas, unless anybody else has got any time and the capability to do some editing. And
volunteer.
The Roy Palmer tape should be done by the end of this week.
Good. Then that'll go up on the Roy Palmer website. It'll go up on it'll go up on the TSF YouTube channel as well, I think. So thank you, Doc, for doing that. And of course, several people have enjoyed the TSF concert from the Whitby Folk Week. That's got quite a lot of views. So thank you, Steve.
Okay, so what a lot we have. What a lot we're doing. So today we're going to go to Michael Bell, who's going to tell us about Milkmaids.
Okay, let me get to shared screen. There's my screen. Play from start.
That's good.
Can you see it? Okay.
Yes, you can. Yes.
Okay, I'll be reading. Thank you for letting me do this. This was intended to be presented at the conference, but unfortunately we couldn't get out of the States. So I beg your forgiveness. It is a paper, and I will try to keep it as lively as I can. Folk singing the pastoral in Isaac Walton's The Compleat Angler, or What the Milkmaids Did. Lao Tzu's famous proverb, give a man a fish and you feed him for a day, teach him how to fish and you feed him for a lifetime, leads to an interesting literary question. What do you teach a man when you write about a book about fishing? Quite a lot, it turns out, according to Marjorie Swann's most recent book-length study of Isaac Walton's The Compleat Angler. According to Swann's remarkable no stone left unturned reading of Walton's work, Since its publication, readers and critics have found a perfect vehicle for defining utopian idealism, for explaining the pastoralist genre, for cataloging the virtues of country living, for explicating coterie poetry, the English Civil War, romantic sincerity, romantic irony, anti-modernism, and her particular interest, contemporary ecological politics. Interestingly, Swann finds of little of interest for women readers in Walton's fishing expedition. In the introduction to her earlier comprehensive edition of The Compleat Angler, she asserted that, quote, though there are a few female characters in Walton's narrative, the hostess of the alehouse at which Piscator lodges, and the milkmaid and her mother who sing for the anglers, women seem irrelevant to the Brotherhood of the Angle. The source of that irrelevance, of course, is the traditionally held belief that fishing in general and the Compleat Angler in particular cover men's subjects in a men's book about a male sport. In opposition, I want to suggest that women are not irrelevant to the reading of Walton's work, but rather are essential to its interpretation and assessing its importance. My reading will be at once folkloristic and feminist. I intend to examine the famous scene at the end of chapter 4, when Walton's avatar and narrator, Piscator, informs his companions as they leave off fishing that he will take them to leave off fishing and set out toward the famous pub with the 20 ballads on the wall, that he will take them first to a farm field where they just might meet 2 milkmaids whom he encountered on an earlier trip and who he is sure will sing some special songs for them. I intend to show that the milkmaid's singing moment is one in which Walton allows the 2 women to speak, well, actually, sing for themselves, thus accidentally and unintentionally creating a description of pastoral life as it was experienced by rural people and not imagined by the English gentry, making The Compleat Angler a folkloric coup de main in which for a few brief moments the popular voice talks back to a gentry fully assured that it knows the true perfection of lives well lived. The scene I propose to discuss is the one in which a daughter and mother sing versions of Christopher Marlowe's The Passionate Shepherd to His Love and Sir Walter Raleigh's The Nymph's Reply to the Shepherd to Walton and his companions. Among the most famous Elizabethan lyrics, Marlowe, Raleigh, and these poems are recognized as emblems of the English pastoral mode. Many of you, I'm sure, encountered them at one point in your education. I first did as set text for my Regents exams, an American equivalent of A-levels. Both poems were written probably in the last quarter of the 16th century and are near perfect embodiments of the playful intimacy, verbal complexity, ironing, bantering, baiting that are the hallmarks of the manuscript performative culture of the English court at the time. Both passed into public awareness at the turn of the century. Marlowe's poem appeared first and alone in the 1599 publication, The Passionate Pilgrim, an anthology of 20 poems attributed to William Shakespeare as collected and published by William Jaggard. And then the two appeared together as they would forever after be linked under the title The Passionate Shepherd to His Love and the Nymph's Reply to the Shepherdess in England's Helicon, an anthology of Elizabethan poems published by John Flaskett in 1600, with the 2 authors identified as Christopher Marlowe and Ignoto. Reprinted repeatedly by the time they appeared in Walton's first edition in 1653, the 2 poems had developed a robust artifactual history, passing not only from courtier culture to book publication, but also passing into the world of the broadside. Sometime between 1619 and 1629, the 2 appear on a broadsheet under the title A Most Excellent Ditty of the Lover's Promises, from the press of Thomas Simcock of London. Simcock is remembered as a successful printer who published and sold ballads on a large scale, as well as new sheets, chapbooks, and other street literature. He prospered for about a decade until he became involved in a printing controversy involving King James I and the Stationers' Company, which resulted in the withdrawal of his patent and his disappearance from the profession. Though clearly variants of Marlowe's and Raleigh's poems, Simcock's broadsheet displays several changes that signal his intention to make them appeal to a broad audience. The broadsheet lists a tune, "Come with me and be my love," to which both lyrics should be sung. It makes clear that the last two lines of each stanza are to be repeated as chorus. Stimcock's broadsheet also reverses stanzas 2 and 3 of Raleigh's poem, thus breaking both the reader's visual parallel between the side-by-side texts and confounding the experience of promise and rejection when the songs are sung back to back. Lastly, Simcock's broadside drops the belt of straw call and response from the original poems and substitutes in their place the broadside's "Silver dishes for thy meat" in Marlowe, and "Why should we talk of dainties then" in Raleigh, thus formally blending the broadsheet with the coterie texts and potentially increasing public interest in them. The belt of straw's exotic imagery is most suited for a court audience. In contrast, the silver dishes stanza with its talk of meat for the gods and the lover's counterclaim of her preference for food blessed by God at least offer a more immediate shareable pleasure. Then, too, the added Raleigh stanza has the further effect of voicing a Puritan-like rejection of the excess and frippery displayed in Marlowe's lyric. Quote, "They are but vain, that's only good which God hath blessed," providing a potential alternate view for a buying audience, sure in the 1620s, to contain a significant number of dissenters. Walton, interestingly, takes no notice of the broadside publication in his first edition in 1653. His milkmaids sing the poems as they were published in England's Helicon, and more importantly, their folk singing is staged to demonstrate that the women's demeanor and performances are everything gentry on the ramble might desire. They are mild and meek, gentle and deferring, charming erotic fantasies of country women in the presence of their betters. No one in Walton's 1653 idyll is going to get pregnant, because his presentation of the encounter echoes the Elizabethan ideal that rural and refined are too unified in awareness, virtues, values, and aesthetics to allow such an unfortunate consequence to occur. After all, just viewed on the surface, it is unlikely, though not impossible, that the milkmaids have independent knowledge of Marlowe and Raleigh's poems as originally printed. However, his goal is to promote the idea that rural England remains an ideal Arcadian retreat, where an elite injured can avoid all the chaos and suffering of the Civil War and the first year of the Protectorate, then Walton's choice makes sense. Still, there is something disquieting about Walton's projection that two working-class rural women singing can deliver on demand the courteous witty come-on and his amorous intended's all too knowing response. Despite the questionable politics, Walton's employment of singing milkmaids in a farm field, a major change in performance context, does shift the performance from being a poetic seduction at court to a public discussion of women's understanding of the games male seducers play. In this stage shift, Maudlin, the daughter, despite being the singer, becomes the actual audience of the words she sings, and her mother's response becomes a knowing caution to her daughter to be wary of beguiling men. It is worth remembering that there were no evident signs of gender in the Marlowe and Raleigh poems. Indeed, that gender ambiguity was an intentional signature of coterie playfulness. Now, in Walton's first crafting of the singing, the two women perform a morality play on the management of women's desires in the face of consequential economics. Make no mistake, the price for acceptable behavior by each is very clear. Marlowe's promise of the sun and the moon for sex may be the more poetic offering, but Walton's promise of a fish for a song is no less powerful, especially when checked against the fact that where he and his companions fished was not open water. In both cases, the proffered gifts are a perilous reminder of the issues of gender, class, and power that lie just below the surface of the seemingly benign encounter. Further evidence of the intrusion of the real world is found in one of Walton's companions' response to the singing. Ventnor is so taken with Maud's performance that he announces to the company that he must bestow Sir Thomas Overbury's milkmaid's wish upon her, quote, "that she may die in the spring, and being dead, may have a good store of flowers stuck round about her winding sheet. An ill-chosen wish with an unequal exchange, if ever there was one. Walton Piscator thanks him for his words, thanks the two women, and then chides Ventnor, quote, to leave Maud alone. Do not you offer to spoil her voice, suggesting that for some in the company in 1653, the milkmaid's gentrified version of a gentleman's desires produces ungentlemanly fantasies. Okay, what just happened? There we go. In Walton's second edition, in 1655, everything changes. An extensive revision of the original manuscript, he added 7 chapters and 5 additional pictures of fish. The milkmaid songs were also altered by the addition of stanzas from the broadsheet and other small changes, including the first use of come as at the beginning of the first line of Marlowe's song, perhaps to facilitate its singing. Whereas the first printed version had 4 stanzas and a reposit, the new Walton printing now has 7, retaining the belt of straw stanzas from the original poem and introducing the dancing shepherds and silver dishes from the broadside. There is no biographical evidence to indicate where Walton got the additional stanzas or why he added them, but several speculations are obvious. He may have found the broadside of his own and incorporated the extra material because he liked it. Someone, perhaps his printer, may have shown him the broadside, and there might have been a discussion about making the staged pastoral moment more popular. He may have heard a folk version sung, perhaps in the pub with the 20 ballads on the wall, and decided to include the new stanzas without subtracting anything written by the older poets. Whatever the source, the revised poems in this new form are the norm in the 1661 and 1688 editions. In Walton's 1676 edition, the 5th and last he will edit, he once again significantly transforms the milkmaid's performance. The Marlowe and Raleigh poems remain unchanged, but he adds a 3rd song sung by Magdalen at her mother's request. This new song is wholly Walton's creation, formed from 2 different broadsides written by the royalist ballad writer Martin Parker. The first stanza, slightly altered, is from Keep a Good Tongue in Your Head, and the second stanza, with several alterations, is from The Milkmaid's Life, both of which can be found at the website of the English Broadside Ballad Archive. The green sickness referenced was a well-known condition. There are broadside and literary references across the 16th to early 20th century, believed to afflict young virginal women. The young girls with the disease were described as suffering from bodily weakness, dietary disorders, heart palpitations, fainting spells, paleness, and an absence of menstruation. It is clear that the social and cultural anxieties surrounding young women's developing sexuality were behind the disease's construction, and its treatments were designed to control this sexuality. The green disease was seen as a particular problem among emerging entrepreneurial middle-class families who were brought about by the physical inactivity of young daughters, whose new wealth freed them from domestic work, and whose new status pressured them to make financially beneficial marriages to strengthen familial prosperity. In Walton's song, the opening octave describes the unintended but predictable consequences of the minor gentry marrying for love. The poem's male singer declares his unhappiness with his new bride. I married a wife of late, and the more's my unhappy fate, and follows this declaration with a precise description of the source of his mistake. Instead of following the expectations of his community, he tells us that he married for love and not for worldly estate because he followed his fancy. The last term is key. Fancy was understood to represent a lower form of imagination. To follow one's fancy was to act without forethought or reason, something that might be acceptable among the landed aristocracy whose wealth could protect them from folly. But for the minor landed gentry and the entrepreneurial middle class, reason and imagination were an absolute necessity. Their successes were built on careful observation of nature and society, on contemplation and refined taste, on carefully drawn conclusions and canny understandings of human frailty. Walton's sorrowful husband's failure to behave pragmatically left him in an unsuitable relationship in which his new bride, with no purpose and nothing to do, simply wasted away. All her beauty did fail. The milkmaid who respond to Walton's octave in a quintet of their own make it clear that they are not so foolish. Their days have meaning and purpose. They have real work to do, real work that occurs in the real world that sustains them through the seasons, even through frost and snow. And the result of living in the world of purpose and meaning is a healthy body and the satisfaction of knowing what really matters. There, call the total performance a one-line shot folk sonnet, expresses a contrapuntal claim against the fairy tale romance Walton has had his milkmaid singing for 23 years. In 5 pithy lines, Walton's edition rejects the humor, the ironic gaze, the too clever for words word cleverness that has been at the core of his claims about the song repertoire of country women. In their place, he allows his characters to sing a plain, honest, heartfelt, homegrown description of life as is lived by those who carry the milking pail. Set in response to the gentry's desires, it offers a public rebuke of the fishing companions' needs while serving as an antidote to the false representation Walton has been promoting. Wonderfully, Maudlin, who had previously borne the responsibility to present the Elizabethan, oh my God, let me start that sentence again. Wonderfully, Maudlin, who had previously borne the responsibility to present the Elizabethan ideal of clever courtship, gets to break free in this second song and celebrate not some Renaissance fantasy land, but what she and her mother know from experience. All at once, their lives cease to be both the imaginary visions of injured gentry in search of peace and quiet, and the fulfillment of external readers' desires for their own idyllic moment away from worldly cares. Instead, Maud becomes the describer of an independent human world where people live and work. All at once, Walton's final attempt to build credibility and color into his fishing trip succeeds in unbargained for ways. Maud's final song becomes a real life speaking up for itself and back to a gentry enmeshed in their own desires. No longer does his milkmaid singer mirror elite desires. Now they are a folk breaking into tradition in the hope of presenting what they would say to the world if the world only permitted them to sing their own lives aloud. Thank you.
Wow, thank you very much, Michael. That was excellent.
So let me get out of screen share so I can see all the faces.
Hey, I see us all smiling at
Yes,
you.
well,
Thank you. That's
now,
great.
now I can either see you and repel in horror of what I've done, or someone may have a question or two asked.
Yeah,
Thank you for listening.
We do have time for some questions if anybody has some or comments. I hadn't realized that there were different editions, I must admit. I've got a copy of the book on the shelf and I've quoted it in talks and stuff, and I had no idea that I should have been reading at least three different editions.
Well, it's interesting. Walton, and I tried to say it, this is part of a longer, but Walton actually did 5 editions, starting with the first one and working to the 1676. And I have another section of this paper which sort of builds on that, because if you look at each edition, they move from the pastoral formally as a classic in 1653. But by the 1661 edition, he adds in Thomas Hobbes' rules for fishing. So now there are 2 texts that are the Compleat Angler, the Walton and then Hobbes. And then in the next edition, he adds in Robert Venerable's rules for fishing, another fishing manual. So over the 5 editions, it ends up with one most of us get, which is the 76, which is Walton and then Charles Cotton's further chapters on fishing. And it moves from being a pure pastoral across those years to becoming a Georgic, which is to say an instruction manual in the classic sense. And as an instruction manual, it begins to, the poems shift in concert with the shift in how it's organized. So if you had a perfect 1676 edition, you would have Charles Cotton's piece on fishing, you would have Thomas Venerable's piece on fishing, and you would have the Compleat Angler as a single volume.
Right. So I don't have to read all the editions. I just have to read the Milkmaid bit.
That's exactly, well, that's what I did.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, and I've also, nobody else has got questions, so I'll carry on. I've never quite understood. I mean, obviously he's he's not reporting an actual meeting with the milkmaids. And I've often thought, well, you know, would milkmaids of that time be singing these courtly songs? And
No.
I mean, you're implying that they would because of the broadsides, and you know, the broadsides meant that the songs had escaped from the court and into the fields, as it were.
Well, at the very least, yes. There's only one copy of the broadside in the Roxborough. Is that how you say it?
Roxborough.
Roxborough ballads. But yes, clearly it was published. The date often picked is 1625, and for 5 years it was actively published and sold. So it would have been in circulation. How far that circulation would have been, and what the singing would have been like. I mean, anyone who's actually heard this song sung knows it's always sung in what I would call sounding like it was an English madrigal, or as my son used to call the tinkle tinkle music, Daddy, that you play.
I like that. Yes.
With a high soprano voice, either male or female, doing the singing.
Well, no doubt,
So
milkmaids really.
it would be interesting to hear what a traditional singer would do, knowing the song and knowing the text, what they would actually, how they would transform them, so that we could have an imaginary version of what the milkmaid, the fishermen, are hearing.
Yeah. So we need to find a milkmaid sing us the song. Yeah, I think that would do. So sorry, we had no questions, no more comments. Thank you very much, Michael, and you kept perfectly to time. So thank you.
Shan's hand was up, wasn't it?
Sorry,
Didn't Shan have her hand up?
I have no hands up on my screen. No.
Well, I was seeing a hand on their picture. I don't know where that came from.
Okay. Speak now. Anybody who wants to. Sorry, I should have said if you want to talk, raise your hand. I thought you'd all know that. No, I don't think so. Normally, somebody with their hand up comes up onto my main screen.
It might be your cursor shaped like a hand.
Yes, it's just a hand. Anyway, we need to move on. Caroline McAfee, going to take us to Scottish Travellers.
Hey, thank you. Well, thank you for the opportunity to talk to you for a second time about my research on the demography of the Scots singers and their sources in the School of Scottish Studies archives as digitised by the Tober and Dowhish project. When I'm asked about my book just in general conversation, people always seem to assume that it must be about the travellers. And it is partly about the travellers, but it's very striking how the lowland song culture has come to be identified in the popular mind almost exclusively with this group of singers who were disproportionately the focus of the school in the heyday of collecting. You'll be aware, for instance, of the title of Macaulay and Seeger's book, Travellers' Songs from England and Scotland. And as far as I can discover, and I go into this a bit in my book, there's very little in the repertoire that is unique to the travellers, mainly some songs using cant words and occasional songs about particular people who were known to the person who composed the song. McCormick, in the 1907 edition of his book about travellers in Galloway, gives fragments of 4 songs as sung by travellers. Peter Cook later refers to these as travellers' songs, but it seems doubtful whether they're all specific to the travellers. One of them certainly isn't. It's the Boatman's Dance, which was also collected by Greg Duncan. The boatmen dance and the boatmen sing, the boatman can do everything. And when the boatman comes ashore, he drinks his money, then he works for more. And if I've understood correctly, this seems to have its origin in an American minstrel song. There's one about a horse race, Maguire's Grey Mare. If you had been on Gilmore Green, you would have seen sport and play there. 2 English flyers, they came down to beat Paddy Maguire's Grey Mare. I can't find anything more about this, which doesn't mean much because I'm not a folk song scholar. So it might be specific to the travellers, although it looks on the face of it like an Irish song. And then there's one about how nice it is to have a little house of your own, which was sung by a traveller child. And McCormick found that very affecting. For it's nice to have a little home of your own and sit on your own fireside. If you've only got a table and a chair, it's all your own and you're welcome there. You're as good as anybody in the land. You're as happy as a king upon the throne. What more is it you want when you've got the wife and kiddies and a nice little home of your own? Again, I can't find anything more about this. Maybe somebody else can find out something about it, but it hardly seems like a composition by somebody committed to the itinerant life. Then there is one of the four that is by its nature a traveller song, in the sense of being unique to the travellers, and that's the Strodgribber, which is partly in cant. My man is she's rumpy and stumpy, raw-boned, fern-tickled and tall, and above all the sugar dickin manishes ere I met, she beats the old roughy and all. Now, I can't find anything but this fragment anywhere else, and I think this might be the only evidence of it, because this seems to be the only attestation of the word Strodgribber, meaning shoemaker. Strods for shoes is recorded, and gribber, maker, but the combination Strodgribber seems to be unique to this little fragment in McCormick. Now, the boundary between the travellers and the general population has always been, I would argue, a permeable one. The mid-19th century writer Simpson points out that given the large families that travellers and gypsies had, even by the standards of the time when large families were the norm, and the limited capacity of their lifestyle to support them, it was inevitable that a proportion of each generation would have to seek their livelihood amongst the settled population. He was able to find large numbers of people in the slums of the big English cities who knew some Romany words. I think he tries to make too much of that, but I mention it for what it's worth. Oops. There was also movement in the opposite direction from the general population into the itinerant population, with the result in Scotland that the Roma component of traveller ancestry must be very small. Without going very far back in the history, which I've written about in an article in Scottish language, the 19th century saw a massive influx of destitute Irish, some of whom stayed in Scotland and to some extent displaced the existing traveller population from the roads. And the Irish were no doubt a source of songs, as Ian Olson tells us they were in northeast of Scotland when Irish navvies built the railroads. So I'll ask you to accept, for the sake of the argument, that the traveller song culture was simply the lowland culture continuing for a little longer, an afterglow, as Jane Pettigrew puts it. The question then becomes, and this is really what I want to talk about, what was special about the travellers that allowed them to preserve this culture long enough for it to be recorded on audio for posterity and brought before audiences to inspire the folk revival? The answer tends to be an almost mystical one. The travellers had a special relationship with the songs. They cared about them more than the shallow materialistic settled population did. Well, being a shallow materialist type myself, I need something more generalisable than that. I tend to think of it in terms of insulation against the forces of modernity. There have been various factors that have provided some insulation in some other areas of Scottish culture. The Gaelic language in the Western Isles, the lingering peasant economy, if I may use that term, subsistence farming with hyper-exploitation of family labour, if you prefer, in the northeast. The three insulating factors that I want to discuss in relation to the travellers. I'm sorry, I can't see the right-hand side of my slides. Are you seeing them, or is it being cut off at the edge?
Yes, I can see them. Yeah.
Okay, let's find it. Yeah, so there's the avoidance of formal education, the authority of the extended family, and making your own entertainment around the fire. None of that is very original, but I think I have some new points to make. Compulsory education to the age of 13 was introduced in Scotland in 1872, extended to 14 in 1883. The travellers assiduously evaded it, and in 1908, the Children's Act came partway to meet their itinerant lifestyle by requiring school attendance for only 200 half-days a year. Many travellers were therefore illiterate even in the 1950s when the school began collecting. And this has been seen, of course, as a mark of authenticity, since a high value was placed by ethnologists on oral transmission. But the relationship between the travellers and literacy is a complicated one. They were embedded in a literate society, so songs originating in print could easily reach them through other singers. McCormick records that he heard travellers singing The Tinkler's Wagon, which was written by William Watt, who died in 1859 and which circulated as a broadside, and also Willie, We Have Missed You, written by Stephen Collins Foster, who died in 1864 and likewise sold as a broadside. The fact that these songs are by known authors would seem to mean by this point in time, I hope somebody will correct me if I'm wrong, but as I say, it would seem to mean that they were born in print, as it were, and this was clearly no obstacle to them reaching the travellers. More importantly, the travellers did have some literate individuals amongst them. For those born before about 1900, it was mainly men who were literate, whereas later it was women. By 1969, about 2/3 in Gentleman and Swift's survey claimed some literacy. These were especially the younger travellers at the time. Now, in a remarkable little detail, Hamish Henderson is reported to have come across copies of the Scots Musical Museum in traveller camps. This was a late 18th to early 19th century collection of music and lyrics, some contributed by Rabbie Burns, originally published over a period of time in 6 volumes and in later editions compressed into 4. I strongly suspect that these very books were the books of old songs that Jeannie Robertson says she acquired from a big house as a child. She used to learn the words and fit a tune to them. The only song that she specifically identifies from this source is Burns' The Northern Lass, known as Cruel Fate in Jeannie's repertoire. Now, this song isn't one of his best known works, and it isn't one that gets anthologized, but it does appear in the Scots Musical Museum. So we're not talking about a purely oral culture, impermeable to print. I would suggest that the real difference between the general population and the travellers in the 1950s was not that the general population possessed the written word, because mass literacy is a societal phenomenon. It creates a market, for instance, that doesn't exist without it. So even if a particular individual doesn't participate in it directly, they are part of the world in which it exists. The difference was that the general population had become largely dependent on the written word. This was firstly to acquire songs, and people often mention that they got somebody to write the lyrics down for them or to dictate them, so the transmission might be person to person without being oral. And secondly, people would often depend on having a written copy to prompt their memory. Steve Byrne, my colleague on Oberondochish, has pointed out that you can sometimes hear the pages rustling as people record their repertoire for the school. It became quite common from at least the mid-19th century for people to write the lyrics of songs down in some kind of notebook. The travellers in the mid-20th century hadn't reached this stage of dependency. Memorisation was still the norm, despite, as I've pointed out, some individuals being literate and thus having access to broadsides and chapbooks and even unusually scattered volumes of a major song collection. Literacy is the immediate and obvious outcome of formal education. There are also important side effects. One is to make children an economic burden rather than an economic asset. In a family-based economic model, whether it's rural agriculture and trades or the itinerant lifestyle, the children contribute, even if it's the older children minding the younger ones and thus freeing the adults to do other things. So the effect of compulsory education was almost immediately seen in a fall in the birth rate in Scotland. Excuse me. The undermining of traditional sources of authority was another effect of compulsory education. The customs, manners, traditions, songs, and stories of the older generation were devalued. Children were taught to value book learning instead. And the travellers were not alone in seeing where this was heading. Ewart Evans describes the resistance of East Anglian farm workers to book learning. 3 East Anglians who were born in different districts between 1880 and 1905 have told me that reading was frowned on at home, as it would tend to make them dissatisfied and would take them out of their station in life. This brings us to the second insulating factor, the extended family. It has been argued that there is an inherently antagonistic relationship between education and the traditional extended family. As described by Teitelbaum, there are 3 historical stages that produce what's known as the demographic transition. In stage 1, there's high mortality, requiring high fertility to maintain the population. The extended family is a major source of pressure enforcing the social norms of early marriage and large families. In stage 2, mortality declines and there's a population explosion. In stage 3, there's a drop in fertility. However, this can only happen once the social and economic institutions traditionally favouring high fertility have been weakened, the extended family being one of these institutions alongside religion. As an aside, this is why sub-Saharan Africa is having the population explosion but hasn't moved to stage 3, the collapse in fertility. It doesn't follow automatically. Something in traditional society has to break first. People's whole idea of what to aim for in life has to change first. The travellers resisted these massive social changes for as long as they could keep their children out of the system. It's not a coincidence then that the travellers in the 1950s and even later exhibited a constellation of social and economic characteristics that favoured the continuity of traditional culture. Early marriage and high fertility, the early withdrawal of children from formal education, low levels of literacy, family-centred economic activity in which children are involved from an early age, extended family living and childcare arrangements, and a traditional structure of authority within the family. These are the norms of a society that hasn't undergone the demographic transition. The extended family is something that travellers themselves emphasised as central to their way of life. They had preserved something that used to be the norm for everybody. Before the enclosure of the commons, the mechanisation of agriculture, the arrival of mass-produced goods via the railways and steamships, by stages drove most of the rural population of peasants and craftsmen off the land and into the industrial towns and cities. And then, as I've suggested, compulsory education undermined the authority of the extended family, meaning above all grandparents, in the remaining strongholds of traditions such as the rural northeast of Scotland. That, I would contend, is the increment of modernisation that left the travellers standing as the only cohesive body of people where whole extended families, not just interested individuals, were still steeped in the old song culture. This is not to say that there weren't families of singers in the general population as well, and the Fisher family notably, and also, for instance, Willie Scott and his brothers in the Borders. But these family networks weren't on anything like the same scale. It didn't last because the next increment of modernisation, recorded and broadcast music, quickly reached the travellers as well. Wind-up gramophones came first, and later electric record players could be run off a car battery. And at the same time, of course, the economic niches that had supported their way of life dwindled to almost nothing, and more than ever, they were pressured into settling down. To bring all this back to the matter of song transmission, I'll quickly show you some of my results. I can compare data for 3 sets of singers. The contributors to Greg Duncan, whose songs were taken down in writing around the 1910s and whose modal decade of birth is the 1840s. The travellers in the School of Scottish Studies data, whose songs were recorded from the 1950s on, and in the data that I've been able to extract, this goes up, what I've got is between about the 1950s and 1970s, with just the odd thing later than that. So in the School of Scottish Studies, I've got the travellers, and then I've got what I call the general population. So for each singer, I made a list of the people that they mentioned having learned songs from. Now, this is very crude because a singer might have learned a dozen songs from one person and just a fragment of a song from another, and I would be counting both of these sources as the same. But I think it is a worthwhile exercise because it points up differences between the travellers and the general population, and between the School of Scottish Studies collection and the earlier Greg Duncan collection. So I divide the song sources into 2 groups: family members on the one hand and everybody else on the other. The traveller emphasis on family transmission is something that's already well known, of course, and the figures that I have certainly bear it out. The bar graph shows the percentage of personal sources who are identifiable as family members of the recipient. In all of these charts that I'm going to show you, the travellers, male and female, are in the middle of the chart. Greg Duncan on the left, and the general population from the School of Scottish Studies data on the right, as well as the very high proportion of family transmission for the travellers, which is over 75% for the women. You can also see that family sources are more important for women than for men in every group. The majority of these family sources for every group are members of the nuclear family. That is mothers, fathers, wives, husbands, brothers, sisters. But as we would expect, the travellers have the highest proportion of extended family sources, much higher than the general population. Greg Duncan is somewhere in between. The family members can be divided up in a different way by generation, so that you have people of the same generation, siblings, spouses, first cousins. You have people of the parental generation, the parents themselves and also aunts and uncles, and people of the grandparental generation, the grandparents themselves, and also great aunts and great uncles, and others who slot in as in-laws, more distant cousins, and so on. There's also, of course, the possibility of learning songs from a younger generation, but the numbers for this are too small for me to do anything with. Now, the parent generation is unsurprisingly by far the most important family source for all groups. So let's home in on the other 2 generations to see where the differences lie. If we take the, sorry, I think the previous slide was the grandparent. Sorry about this. I've lost what I wanted to show you now. Oh dear. Sorry about that. Right, I'll find the slide that I wanted to show you. Yes, this is the grandparent generation. And what we see here is the female general population in the school data are noticeably short on this source, especially in comparison with the females in Greg Duncan. But where the travellers really stand out from both other groups is their relatively high proportion of sources in the same generation, getting on for a quarter in the case of the traveller women. And again, the travellers are the two columns in the middle. This is no doubt a reflection of the large families that travellers had. So there were lots of siblings and first cousins. And it's also a measure of the robustness of the tradition, with a healthy amount of song transmission moving sideways through a generation and not just down the generations. And this isn't, I think, what we would have expected to find. I think we might have expected the travellers to lead on grandparents, whereas this distinction belongs to the female contributors in Greg Duncan. So I think it shows the value of the quantitative approach for bringing out things that aren't visible to the naked eye. So to deal very briefly with the final insulating factor, since this is rather obvious, camping in the open air, as long as the countryside was open to it, which is another story, made it easier to assemble large and shifting groups of the extended family, as opposed to the cramped conditions of urban life. The campfire is also, of course, an ideal situation for singing and music making. There are no neighbours through the wall to be disturbed. There's no master of ceremonies or time when the hall has to be emptied. And this is particularly relevant, I think, to the long narrative ballads. As a performance, the big ballads make considerable demands on the attention of the listener, but the hearers in a campfire setting don't have to give their undivided attention in competition with the demands of other adults, children, animals, the fire, or the sudden urge to make a cup of tea. In conclusion, I would suggest that there was nothing peculiar about the travellers' relationship with the traditional lowland song culture, except that a dwindling number of them were able to hold on to it in a sort of time warp. They thus came to symbolise, I feel, a window onto what Laslett calls the world we have lost, the pre-industrial world that we've been deracinated from so thoroughly and so many forgotten generations ago that we hardly even know how to mourn the loss of it. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Caroline. Excellent. Do you want to unshare, as they say?
Oh, yes. Right.
That was fascinating. Thank you. Anybody who wants to ask a question, please put your hand up. Margaret has a hand up. Margaret? Or is that clapping?
Well, actually, that was my applause.
That was applause.
But anyway, that's okay. This is fascinating. Thank you very much for a very enjoyable presentation. When you were talking about the literacy part, I immediately thought of Elizabeth Stewart talking about her Aunt Lucy Stewart of Fetter Angus, whose collection became very well known and all over the world, really, when Kenneth Goldstein published. But as Elizabeth said, not only did Lucy have books, she had a Grundig tape recorder. And that, I think, is a revelation too. They recorded each other and they could exchange the songs. And also, when you listen to the instrumental music, that was her uncle Ned Stewart. He's phenomenal. He's just like Paganini with the style of his playing. We don't hear of him now, but you can hear him on Topper and Tolchas, Custorichus. And a lot of them kept notebooks. Bell kept a notebook and they passed around songs. I think they prided owning a book was important. And when you looked at what they were singing, they weren't necessarily singing what was on the page. It's very interesting indeed.
That is an interesting added perspective there. Yes, thank you.
Liz Milner.
Okay, not to get all A.L. Lloyd on you, but part of this may also be that the work that people did in the towns wasn't really conducive to the sort of songs you'd sing around the campfire because you had to match the machine sounds. And also just in my work, if I at the library burst into song, I will get into big trouble. So part of it, the conditions of work had changed so much. And that's my point.
Yes, there was somebody, I forget the name, somebody did a study of the effect of machinery in the workplace on singing in England. And apparently factories actually banned singing and whistling because it affected the pace that they were trying to set. And then later, I mean, Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times, sort of captures what was happening at that time with work and time and motion studies and so on. And then later music was being piped in from the radio to sort of ease the tedium, which people would in the past would have done with making their own music. Yeah.
Thank you. David, without guitar. You're muted, David. You're muted. You're still muted, David.
Probably just as well. Yes, hi, Carol. Thanks. You make a very good case. I just wonder about this business of the sort of resistance to education, literacy, and so forth. If that's not a phenomenon of already, for want of a better term, sort of industrialized times. I find it hard to imagine in, say, early modern times, where of course, a lot of people wouldn't have had the opportunity anyway. But to become literate would have conferred a degree of social advantage.
Yeah, it's not actually that hard to learn your letters enough if you don't have to produce something that's entirely correctly spelled. You can pick up a little bit of literacy without having to go in through compulsory education for X number of years. It's curious, excuse me. It's curious that there was a shift in being mainly men in the traveller community to being mainly women, and I think there's you can speculate. I mean, I find myself speculating about it, but I don't think there's any way of really finding out. But I suspect that men would have been able to pick up a little bit from, for instance, farm workers that they were working alongside, whereas women weren't so much in contact with the general population. But then later it was the girls, and I think possibly more effort was maybe made to keep the boys at home, where they would be learning how to make a livelihood, and allowing the girls maybe to go to school more. But then girls are more compliant at school as well. They've maybe buckled down and learned something, where the boys might just have been kicking their heels up and waiting to get out as soon as they could.
Thank you. We'll have to move on a bit swiftly now. So Conrad, can you hear me? Conrad.
Abby has his hand up.
Conrad doesn't sit. Yeah, Abby does. All right, we go to Abby first because Conrad's not paying attention. Abby?
There. Two small things. I knew Hamish pretty well, and I asked him. I found some classical references in the child ballads in 280, which is not the Gabbaluni Man, the next one. And there were classical references there, Jason and stuff like that. And I asked him, and he said, well, you got to remember that the Scots were always literate. not each individual may not be literate necessarily, but the community was literate and had access to it. And there was some famous, Willie Matheson had his, all of his stuff famously that he carried around. So there's nothing new to it. You can write down the songs. That's really handy. The other thing about what you said, I did a tiny bit of collecting on the Isle of Lewis, and it's at Tobar, what I did do. And it was in the summertime, and I was amazed to see that in Lewis, the sons, well, people have to go to the mainland for jobs. In the summertime, they would go back and visit, and they would all of them would bring tape recorders with them and collect their own families, not just in the city. Everybody had a tape recorder. So they were very friendly to me because they were quite accustomed to being taped.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm open.
Sorry?
Caroline.
No, I agree. People are not nearly so naive or unsophisticated as we maybe like to imagine sometimes.
Thank you. Conrad, we'll give you one more try. Conrad?
Oh, yes. I've been looking at these things a bit. It seems that you need a special environment for passing along entire chunks of culture. One thing you have to work with is frames of reference. You have to construct them so that you're there with not learning, which is installing information in your brain, but knowing something in depth, an entire cultural concept, or even the concept of architecture, something that you have to understand in depth. The educational process for those seems to be entirely different. You can't send somebody to more education. You have to send them to more culture, more exposure to family, more exposure to relatives, and more time. And whether you do that at some point in time in early development, or probably many times in segments of your life, spending that quality time and to obtain a multidimensional experience-related development. So that when you come to a situation where song is called for, you refer to that frame of reference that has been built up on that topic. So it's more than education, I think, but it does, as people have said, have a lot to do with time that's available. You can only be so many days singing during the week, and there are fewer places to do that. And there's a lot of social pressure against being different, bringing it to a high school or a middle school. People won't treat you very well. There's an internal, external border there. Insiders, outsiders. You're being an outsider. That's even more difficult. So we would wonder that it might be good to educate people of different cultures together so that they can have time for quality development of frames of reference. That's it.
Thank you, Conrad. Peter, have you got the shortest comment ever in the world?
Yes. Well, I thought it would be very relevant to comment again about the attendance requirements for travellers has always been low. They were always allowed to take time off to go to the tatty picking, to the berry fields and so on. So they were attending school for much less time, and obviously this disrupts their education. Also the fact that the large extended families, I know a number of travellers that I've collected songs from who learnt their songs from grandparents because they were brought up from young childhood by grandparents, with the grandparents having nothing better to do than to sing songs and tell stories and teach the young boys how to fight and tell them stories of the past and ballads at length. And that enabled transmission of it through two generations quite easily. And I think this is very significant when you've got large families that are less so, as has been pointed out, as you develop, as society develops and you get less large families. That's the only point I wanted to make at the moment.
Thank you, Peter. Caroline, did you want to say one last word?
No, thank you for your comments, everybody.
Yes,
nuances.
Thank you for a very interesting. We could go on for some time actually on that one, but maybe we'll come back on another day. Thanks again, Caroline. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, lucky people, you're going to get me now. Only because we were short of a paper. I wasn't going to give this here. I presume you can see that. I presume you can hear me. what this is there was an article in an online American magazine called The Bitter Southerner, which came out in 2020. I'll give you the link in a minute. Which really does a hatchet job as often on Cecil Sharp. Probably wouldn't matter, but over here, I mean, I doubt if many people over here read The Bitter Southerner, but it was circulated on the web about 2 years ago. It was doing the rounds. It was sent to me by two completely different people saying this proves that Cecil Sharp was a racist, and so on. So it does matter from that point of view. So I dashed off a response, not very well written, but it was dashed off. But the Bitter Southerner have declined to publish it. I'm not surprised. So here you are, because we have some space. This is what you're going to get. I'm going to read it, so it's all going to be a bit stilted. And some of you won't like what I've got to say. So that's the address there. I was going to copy it into the paste it into the chat, but I haven't yet, so somebody could do that. The article I'm talking about is called Somebody Died, Babe, a musical cover-up of racism, violence, and greed. And it's by Kevin, I don't know how to pronounce his name, Kerberg, maybe, so that's what I'm going to say, and Jeffrey A. Keith. So I'm going to call them Kerberg and Keith throughout this. So Kerberg and Keith's article starts with the building of the Swannanoa Rail Tunnel in North Carolina between 1875 and 1879. This was a major engineering feat which transformed the Blue Ridge Mountain area. But they reveal that the tunnel was dug mainly by black labourers, many of whom were convicts working in appalling conditions under armed guard. They claim that hundreds died of sickness, accidents, or at the hands of the white guards, and most were unceremoniously buried beside the new tracks. The article goes on to show that these facts were systematically written out of the official story of the true history of the project, which is celebrated as a major achievement of white American skill and enterprise. Now, this is indeed a distressing and shameful story, which needed to be revealed and acknowledged. And there's no doubt about that, but that's not what I'm going to talk about today, because the authors then move on to the second section of their article, where they maintain at quite a long, great length, that a song popular in the later white folk song world called Swannanoa Tunnel, Route 3602, is part of the cover-up, and that its development is both evidence of a continuing white conspiracy to hide the truth and an example of cultural appropriation by whites of black musical expression. So this is the musical cover-up of racism, violence, and greed in their article's subtitle. Now, again, I must stress that I'm not questioning the history of the event or the, in effect, politics around that event. But according to them, this cover-up all starts with Cecil Sharp, which is what I want to concentrate on, because I believe they have quite deliberately misrepresented him to fit their narrative of white cultural appropriation. He's already often branded a racist, so he is a convenient stooge. Now, Sharp and Maud Carpeles collected two versions of a song which they titled Swannanoa Town, both from white singers in North Carolina. One from Mrs. Sarah Buckner and Mrs. Ford, two of them, at Black Mountain in September 1916, and the second from Mrs. Julie Bourne in Mickerville in October 1918. Sharp published the first in his book, English Folk Songs from the Southern Appalachians, there it is, in 1917, And Carpeles published both versions in her 1932 edition of the book. Now, the manuscripts for both versions can be seen on the Vaughan Williams Memorial Library website. So there you have a picture of the book in question. Now, the two versions of the song, Swan and O'er Town, are not identical, but are clearly the same song. And it's important to remember that the song was collected twice, which possibly are 2 years apart in different places, which possibly indicates a generally known song rather than it being a rare item known only from a single source. We do not know whether Sharp and Carpeles encountered it any more times without writing it down. So here's the version. This is from the 1932 Maud Carpeles edition. And as you, we won't read it all out, but Swan and O'er Town O, Swan and O'er Town O, note the O there. That's my home, baby, that's my home. I'm going back to Swan and O'er Town O, before long, baby, before long, and so on. Notice verse 5, we'll mention it in a minute. When you hear my pistol firing, another man dead, baby, another man dead, which is where Kerberg and Keith have got the title for their article. And then it finishes with, I'm going back to Swan and O'er Town O, that's my home, baby, that's my home. Second version, the B version from Mrs. Julie Bourne, it's a bit longer. It's a little bit different, but it starts again, I'm going back to Swan and O'er Town O, that's my home, baby, that's my home. There's a hammer in there. There's also the pistol, and there's letters from lovers and all sorts of things in there. It's not particularly coherent. So this is what Kerberg and Keith make of this. A year later, i.e. 1917, Sharp published it as Swan and O'er Town in his influential collection English Folk Songs from the Southern Appalachians. The lyrics Swan and O'er Tunnel have become Swan and O'er Town O. In his end notes, Sharp references John Henry as an American variant of the song. In other words, Sharp claimed Swan and O'er Town explicitly, Swan and O'er Tunnel by extension, and John Henry for good measure as English in origin. He does no such thing. In his introduction, he quite clearly includes the song in the list of items not known in England, and in fact, he makes it quite clear that there are noticeable differences between the two countries and that the American songs are, in his opinion, no way inferior. This is quoting Sharp's introduction. Several of the mountain song tunes, okay, this is the tunes, are, in my opinion, very characteristic and beautiful. He lists 11 songs. These, for instance, would challenge the very finest of folk tunes that have been found in England. Some of them, too, while conforming in type to the regular English folk tune, are yet in a measure so different that they may fairly be considered a fresh contribution to the subject. So he's not claiming that all the songs are English, and in fact, he's making a point that some of the American songs are as good and maybe even better than the English ones. Then he moves on to the text. Some of the song texts are quite new to me and are not found, as far as I've been able to discover, in any of the standard English collections. He lists 13 examples, including Swan and O'er Town. So he makes it quite clear that this is not an English song. Kerberg and Keith also, in that previous quote, hit on the fact that in his notes, Sharp stresses that John Henry is American. He's stressing the word American in his end note. It's far from claiming it as an English origin for John Henry. He does it to distinguish it from other references in the book, which are to British sources. The book was published in Britain. It explains this in the introduction. Kerberg and Keith make this claim, repeat this claim later on in the article. So Kerberg and Keith present two more pieces of evidence against Sharp and his handling of this song. The first being that he has renamed the song Swannanoa Town. So here we go. Beyond bizarre mistitle, Sharp's version is anomalous in other ways. It's in triple meter, like a waltz. This phrasing removes the song's utility. The beat on which the workers would have swung the hammer is gone. Despite some lyric parallels with other versions, Sharp's transcription contains no references to railroading, a cave-in, or a tunnel. Through poetic and sonic omission, this version conceals a record of social injustice and tragedy. So, they're claiming that as I said, Sharp has renamed the song Swannanoa Town when it was originally Swannanoa Tunnel in order to hide its shameful past. Okay, apart from the fact that tunnel and towno can easily be explained by a mishearing of North Carolina pronunciation by visiting collectors, especially in 1916. They hadn't been in America very long, certainly not in the South. But the accusers offer no evidence that it was called tunnel in the first place, as both versions say the narrator is going back to Swannanoa. That's my home, baby. That's my home. Swannanoa Town is far more likely than Swannanoa Tunnel. Come back to that in a minute. The second claim is that while the song was originally a work song in the rhythm of hammering rocks or steel, Sharp has presented it in triple meter. The two transcriptions that we showed earlier on put it in 3/2. Yeah, sorry. A glance at the manuscript shows that Sharp headed the transcript of Mrs. Bones' tune with the word lullaby, which is a clue that is why the song was sung in near waltz time. All the lullabies I sang to my grandchildren were in waltz time. So if any change in meter has been made, which has been stated but not proven, it was by his informant or some previous singer and not by Sharp. Sharp, as far as we know, and as he claims in his introduction, wrote down the tunes exactly as they were sung. He made a point of it, as we all know. Again, note that both versions are in 3/2 time. As will be seen below, the authors offer no evidence that it was originally a work song anyway, however much they want it to be. Now, as you all know, I'm not an expert on tunes, but a colleague who is with us today, I think, has pointed out that you can sing the tunes as notated with hammer blows if you wish. The song, as collected by Sharp and Carpeles, contains no mention of trains, tunnels, convicts, cave-ins, or other tragedies. Cairberg and Keith call this poetic and sonic omission, to claim that these elements have been deleted, rather than, as is quite possible, were never there in the first place. There is a hammer in Mrs. Bourne's version, but that's been introduced from the song John Henry, which has also supplied some other verses in that version. There is a death, but it's from pistol shots, not from cave-ins or horrible guards. So here's the thing. Sharp and Carpeles collected the first known versions, as far as I know. So any statements made by Cairberg and Keith about its earlier history are pure speculation, unless they can cite earlier evidence. The article has no footnotes, but I'm sure if they'd got it, they would have said it. The collectors may have heard Swannanoa Tunnel as Swannanoa Towno twice, 2 years apart, or the song may have been called Town rather than Tunnel, and may have had no connection at that time with the tunnel at all. As already mentioned, there are no clues in the song to link it with the tunnel, and there's the intriguing possibility that the tunnel was introduced later into a song about the town by later singers. Cairberg and Keith offer no evidence that the tunnel was whited out of the text, nor that the song was originally a hammer work song, nor even that it was originally sung by black people, nor that it has anything to do with the maltreatment of convicts, and so on. All this is necessary for their argument, but it's all built on sand, unless, of course, they have evidence otherwise. Nor do the authors explain how two visiting English collectors in the area for a few weeks would know anything about the tunnel's dreadful history or the song's origin. 37 years after the tunnel was completed, especially as the authors are at pains to show that the real story had been hushed up. Even if the song is part of a white cover-up, how can Sharp and Carpeles be blamed for any of it? That's one of the fundamental flaws in cover-up conspiracy theories. If the cover-up is effective, then those who come later can't be blamed for what they don't know. Cairberg and Keith got to document what later white American singers and collectors did with the song, and they seek to demonstrate how these subsequent players were part of the conspiracy. Although again, it is difficult to see how this could be so if the truth was hidden from them. I have not checked their argument beyond Sharp's involvement, but if their treatment of the evidence in that respect is as cavalier as their treatment of Sharp, it needs to be carefully tested. Folk revival performers are rarely historians and simply quote what they read and hear like everybody else. There is no doubt that Black history has been distorted and whitewashed over the years, and that this has been widespread enough to be branded a deliberate conspiracy. But to assume that it is a major factor in all cases is lazy research and flawed history, and is a gift to those who would wish to deny the tendency. All the material I have cited was easily available to Cairberg and Keith, either in the book in the introduction or online at the VWML for the manuscripts. And obviously there's a picture of Cecil Sharp and a plug for our new book published by the Ballad Partners, written by David Sutcliffe, available from the Ballad Partners website. I think David's with us today. If anybody's got any questions about the book rather than what I'm talking about, but it's a wonderful book. And if you want to know about Cecil Sharp, read that rather than The Bitter Southerner. The final word on the Cairberg and Keith article. In the Appalachian trips, Maud Carpeles was Cecil Sharp's co-collector. She took down the words while he noted the tunes. She was instrumental in establishing a rapport with the people who sang for them. She typed up the words in the evenings. She was involved in the publication of the books. She even nursed Sharp when he was ill and kept the show on the road. She was a full member of the team. But Cairberg and Keith never mention her in their paragraphs about Sharp. It's a well-known fact that women have been written out of history by men, so we can assume that Cairberg and Keith are part of that misogynist conspiracy. That's it. That's why they refused to publish it. I've got to stop share. And thank you very much. Ryan, of course, has raised his hand, presumably about the work song bit. Ryan, would you like to unmute?
Yes. Hi, Steve. Thanks very much. I didn't actually realise you were going to be giving that today. I've not been paying attention. Right. Yes, a few comments. If I've got time to add them, I'll be as quick as I can. One is that yes, that song is part of a family that many people know as 9 Pound Hammer or 10 Pound Hammer, which is a work song and would normally be sung with the hammer beat or the wood chopping beat, and has been collected by people like Lomax in that form. It's also interesting that Cecil Sharp did collect another version of a song that he called The Old Hammer, which is definitely part of that same family, although it doesn't have, I don't think, any verses in common with the Swan and Oa Tunnel, Swan and Oa Town song, but he credits the Old Hammer as a Negro shanty in his notes. And in fact, in a number of songs in his notebooks, he says that a song has Negro origins, even though he may well have collected it from a white singer. He's certainly not trying to claim that all the songs in that book are English folk songs. You can criticize the title shows, but it's absolutely clear from what he says about the songs and from the songs themselves that many of them were American-made songs, and he knew that they were, and he credited them as such when he could. And the next comment I'd like to make was about that laughable comment about waltz time. I mean, he notated it in 3/2. 3/2 is not waltz time. Waltz time is do 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 do. 3/2 is a time signature that unaccompanied singers often use, particularly many of the singers that Sharp had collected in the Appalachian Mountains. And this song makes perfect sense. In 3/2, you'd sing it as, I'm going back to Swan and Oa Tunnel, that's my home, baby, that's my home. Bearing in mind that one of the women he collected it from was singing as a lullaby. We don't know whether that woman had ever heard it as a work song, in which case it would have sounded like, I'm going back to Swan and Oa Tunnel. But we don't know if she ever heard it like that, or whether she herself made the decision that as a lullaby it would be more appropriate to sing it in 3. But whatever it is not waltz time, and it's entirely logical that Sharp would have notated it accurately, as he did pretty well most of the time, in 3/2. So that just, to me, demonstrates that whoever wrote about waltz time has a complete ignorance of traditional song in the field. Also, the fact that verses get omitted as down the chain of transmission, and that the tunnel verses may at one time have been part of that song, but it was entirely natural process for a particular singer to sing a set of verses that might have added, might have subtracted. The 9 Pound Hammer family has got all kinds of floating verses about the bulldog barking and the pistol firing and so on. So there's no definitive text of it. And the other thing I would say just briefly about the Swan and Oa Towno being possibly a mishearing, and bear in mind also that Cecil Sharp, or Maud Cowperleys, as you say, was notating the texts, wrote down the word as hoodow, H-O-O-D-O-W, which people who've looked at it subsequently have said should actually have been when you hear the hoot owls, calling, sign of rain. But they misheard that, so it doesn't seem implausible they might have misheard the tunnel as a towno, knowing, as you say, little about the dialect and the pronunciation in the place they were. So I could go on, but I can see lots of other hands. So that's my contribution.
Thank you, Brian. I won't answer any of those points because we have 3 other hands up at least. So Liz, next one.
Okay, I was just going to say one of the things about conspiracy theories is they have echoes of other stories. And the Swan and Oa story sort of echoes the 1830s story of Duffy's Cut. And I see Joan has mentioned some Chinese worker stories, but they all involve a conspiracy to hide the murder of workers who weren't part of the dominant culture. So that's another thing that I found kind of fascinating about this.
Thank you, Liz. Yes, Abby? No, not Abby. Okay, Vic? Wake up, Vic.
No, it's just to say, I mean, I think your comments are spot on. I mean, why do we have to waste our time on this utter crap journalism? I really don't know, but we do. Just an absolute footnote here. John Henry is not an English song, but in the wonderful I think it's wonderful, Origins of the Popular Style by Van der Merwe, who's actually a South African, not an American. He shows that one of the American tunes to John Henry is actually the Lads of Birmingham Town that Harry Cox used to sing. And he does it pretty convincingly. I mean, I don't think he's always that convincing, but you know, this is complicated stuff, and that is such an those floating verse songs are so incoherent. How you get much sense out of them other than the emotional sense of, you know, the performance itself, I really don't know. But I think you're spot on, Steve. I'm just pleased you got time to do the valuable things in your life and not just, you know, the crap shoveling. That's me finished.
I should point out that one of our people who is here today has said that I'm echoing. Somebody's.
You'll still.
Can you mute?
It.
One of the people who's with us today has said that the Bitter Southerner, which is the magazine, does have some good articles. So it's not all this bad in inverted commas. It's just that whenever people talk about Sharp, all sense, you know, all reality goes out the window. Conrad, can you be?
I'm here, unmuted. I think that it's as somebody has pointed out, why are we looking at this song? This song is, and related songs, hammering songs, workers' songs with minorities. What is driving us to look at the song, which is also driving its development? This article is going to cause development change. We're counteracting it. We're pushing back with straightening it out. And why is this happening? That's the part of the song that we need to look at. How is that structure so compelling that we'll have to look at it, or it has to be redone or revised? So that's an idea to go after. What about its structure and its form? The other thing is just a little bit of a humor here. I looked at that book cover, and old Cecil looks a little bit dark.
Dark in what way? Dark skinned?
Well, yes, I think he looks a little on the dark side, dusky, as we might say.
Well,
Who knows? Maybe he was making tunnels.
Well, maybe he was. Yes, vitamin D deficiency because he was down the tunnel.
That's right.
Yeah.
Too many cigars.
Yeah. Right. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for today, for your comments on that. You missed my comments at the beginning, Brian. I wasn't going to give that paper today. It was just that we had a gap, so we had to put something in. Thank you, everybody, for your comments and for your presence today. I hope you've enjoyed yourselves and learned something. And we'll all go home and sing Swannanoa Town rather than Tunnel, please. Everybody happy? We'll see you all again in November. I've forgotten the date. November the something or other. I told you at the beginning. Cheerio, everybody. Bye-bye. Thank you to our two speakers.